Hi, I'm Conor Friedersdorf, a staff writer at The Atlantic magazine.
And hi, I'm Sommer Mathis. I'm the editor of The Atlantic Cities, which is The Atlantic's urban affairs website.
So we're going to be talking about cities today, and I wanted to tell you about one that I just got back from recently. I was on my honeymoon and went to Christchurch, New Zealand.
Yeah, I've been dying to hear about this.
And I've never been to New Zealand before, and it is an idyllic country. You drive around the South Island where we were, and it's just miles and miles of green hills everywhere. And my understanding is that Christchurch was the second. Let's see. Christchurch was the second or third largest city, and now it is the third or fourth. It's dropped a spot.
Yeah, it's a little bit down
because of this gigantic earthquake, or actually two earthquakes, a series of I guess two big ones and then a few aftershocks that have really devastated the city. And, I heard about the Christchurch earthquake in the news when it happened a couple years back. And being from Los Angeles, where earthquakes are a relatively common thing, and even really big earthquakes like the Northridge quake, like the San Francisco earthquake back in the late 80s.
Of course.
You hear about these big earthquakes and people unfortunately die in them. They'll have a freeway collapse or something. The Bay Bridge collapsed, of course, in the San Francisco earthquake. But in the case of those two earthquakes, I think of kind of a first world city earthquake as being something where you may have some deaths, you may have some piece of infrastructure collapse, but the city is basically livable and inhabitable.
Mm-hmm.
And I was sort of astonished to bike around Christchurch and to see that basically these whole swaths of the downtown are just literally no-go zones. They'll have, a chain link fence at an intersection, and there's no way in to just blocks upon blocks upon blocks of the city.
So still, even today.
Yeah, and that's the case even today, where you just, you can be in some places that you can tell were devastated by the earthquake because there are buildings that are condemned and empty, because there are lots where there used to be buildings. There's a lot of empty lots that look like they don't belong where they are. And yet there's still these vast swaths of the downtown where you get to a certain point and you can't go any farther, and you can just kind of look and you can see the crumpled tops of buildings, and it almost looks like a kind of, disaster zone. It's almost as if someone built a huge set for a post-apocalyptic movie. And, you see the tops of certain buildings crumbled. You see others that have big metal shipping containers that are stacked in front of them because at some point they're going to try and restore the building. But right now, even a small earthquake would cause it to topple over, and they don't want that to destroy other things. And so the shipping containers are preventing them from tumbling over. Something you've covered on the city's site is using these shipping containers in another way, which is as sort of a ready-made structure that you can put a store inside of.
Right. There's been some shopping mall projects where they've kind of built these temporary, but leaning towards permanent at this point, kind of new shopping environments where they're actually built entirely out of shipping containers.
And that sounds actually really ugly, or at least it does to me when I think about shipping containers. It actually doesn't look bad. It's nicer than you would think.
Yeah.
And it made me realize how malleable a shipping container is as far as, what you can do with it in a built environment. Stack it in different ways and cut different holes in it for doors and windows.
Absolutely. There have been a ton of designers over the last, I would say, year or two that have kind of really looked at the shipping container as something that doesn't have to be ugly, and they've made it. There's the sort of novelty factor of it too, I suppose, where it's like, oh, I'm trying on pants inside a shipping container, at the Gap. But there's something fun about it, and that may even be sort of played out at this point. But that I've seen a number of pretty innovative designs that are based entirely around shipping containers, where it's really not. There's sort of kind of a fun industrial aspect to it. It's not ugly at all.
Right. It's also interesting that. So my understanding is that in this earthquake, or in these two earthquakes, I should say.
Yeah.
Despite all of the damage, there weren't very many deaths. In fact, I'm not sure there were any deaths. And so I think that that matters, of course, for the immediate reason, but also because I think it changes the way that people are responding to it. And I guess what I mean by that is just like the nature of the tragedy. I think people are able to be a little bit more lighthearted about it than they ever would be if it both devastated their city and killed a bunch of people.
Right.
There's not the somberness. People are obviously very upset, and people lost homes and businesses. But at the same time, there are these kind of lighthearted things around the earthquake, and one of them is, like I said before, there are these various empty lots that seem like they oughtn't to be empty when you're looking at the urban landscape. And there are these little community projects to kind of fill in the gaps in the cityscape and to do fun things there that bring people together. One of them that I saw was this dance floor, and they put out a washing machine. It's just like a washing machine sitting by a dance floor. And there's lights strung up so that it works at night too. And the washing machine motor is powering a little iPod dock where anyone can come and plug in their iPod,
right,
and then put in a quarter or two as if into a pay washing machine, and it'll play music for X amount of time, and people come together and dance around. And there are signs up everywhere that if you want to propose your own fill in the gap kind of thing, this is something you can do. I understand pretty easily as a resident with an idea if you want to bring people together in some way. And then the other activity that I noticed when we were driving around was watching buildings being demolished. And part of the reason why the city is in such dire straits is that there are all of these buildings that weren't toppled by the earthquake, but are nevertheless uninhabitable. And these are buildings that are, I'm trying to think of how tall they were. I mean, we're not talking like a New York City style. It doesn't look like Midtown New York or anything. But still pretty sizable buildings, maybe 20-story buildings.
Oh, that's pretty tall. Yeah.
Yeah. And so we saw a building that was probably 15 stories that was getting torn down by this big, cool-looking hydraulic crane that looked like a dinosaur and was just literally taking bites out of the side of the building.
Okay, that's awesome.
Pulling off the facade piece by piece. And there were these big concrete slabs that were kind of ringing the outside of the building, and people were standing across the street, way closer than you would ever be permitted to stand in the United States, but still, I think, a safe distance. And so these slabs would be pulled down, and you would see breaking glass sometimes, and the concrete would fall and hit the ground and cause a big thud. And it was just something that people had stopped to watch on their way home from work, or maybe if it was in their neighborhood, they walked a few blocks from their apartment, and so these tear-down things were just kind of small spectator events, and people would be standing around and talking about, what are you doing since the earthquake? Oh, my office is closed. Oh, my business is closed. And then finally, a last interesting thing is just it's sort of this big natural experiment, or maybe a natural experiment in the legal stuff that surrounds, insurance and property, how are you going to rebuild, and all of this kind of thing, and then a kind of larger second order question, which is the fair thing to, go through the set of rules that was established before the earthquake and treat it like any other legal case. Or is this such a huge thing that someone needs to come in and sort of scrap the plan before and say, that's going to take too long, we can't have our whole city going through years of litigation.
Right.
So here's what's going to happen.
So you have to adapt to the sort of new set of rules that exist post-earthquake. Yeah. So was your sense with seeing all of these kind of, you're describing a city that has a lot of sort of deactivated space, right? Not only sort of empty lots, but vacant buildings that may not have been torn down yet or in the process of being torn down. And so you've got, whole pockets of a city where people still live, where there are empty spaces, and it doesn't only take an earthquake for a situation like that to happen, right? I mean, think about some of the cities in the U.S., for example, that have been devastated by the recession. You've got cities like Detroit, like Baltimore, like any number of sort of Rust Belt cities where there are a lot of vacant buildings and empty lots, and not a lot of lending happening to sort of make those build there or renovate those buildings, or even to just tear down the empty ones, and so you don't have this big blighted structure. Right. Which I guess I'm curious about what your sense was about, was the earthquake, because what we're seeing in a lot of these cities with all these empty spaces is a lot of creativity in kind of reactivating those spaces, even if just in temporary ways, right? Like, so you've got the sort of pop-up trend and, the parklet trend, which is, a lot of cities are kind of finding these little small patches of land and kind of turning them into, temporary / semi-permanent places for residents to just sort of use as a little miniature park space. So was your sense that the act of the earthquake was sort of forcing the residents of Christchurch to get super creative about how to reactivate these dead spaces? Or, because I could imagine that, because you mentioned, like, it probably helps that there wasn't a really high death toll in that particular city, but if there's a sort of lighthearted take on reactivating these spaces that are clearly, the result of a terrible tragedy. I think that's interesting. But we certainly see the same thing even when there hasn't necessarily been a sort of terrible tragedy, specific, like an earthquake.
Yeah, I certainly saw lots of evidence of of creativity, or at least I should say, I wasn't there long enough to really evaluate how things are going, but certainly attempts at creativity.
Yeah.
And the recognition that this is going to be an important thing if they're going to make the city as livable and enjoyable as it could be. I think, though, that in a way they have a bigger challenge than a city that has, a city like Detroit, right, that's had people move away from certain neighborhoods. The challenge for Detroit is bigger in certain ways, because I think Christchurch is going to rebound.
Yeah.
And maybe Detroit will too. I'm less sure about that. At the same time, in one sense, Christchurch has a bigger challenge, and that's that a lot of these buildings, especially in the roped off areas, but even in other areas too, it's this weird period of flux now where no one knows what's going to happen to them, because some of them, for example, it's a process of insurance companies going in and making a call about whether, if this building is torn down, there will be insurance money to rebuild it.
Right. Whether the risk is too high and that, yeah.
So there's all these tear down or repair calls that have yet to be made. There are certain buildings where everybody wants to err on the side of safety, and no one knows quite how stable they are. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll be declared usable eventually.
Right.
And then there are all these areas where, I was talking about this crane going in and tearing down this building. Well, probably it took them 48 hours to tear down this building that I'm talking about, and maybe another week or two to clear away the rubble. And then 2 weeks later, the whole city landscape has changed right there in that spot, right? You don't have to have, there's certain fences you can take down. You don't have to have people on one side of the building, standing back from it.
Right.
And maybe there's a building that's unsafe, that's torn down, and another building that's been uninhabitable because it could have fallen on it. But that other building is perfectly safe. Now people can move back in. So it's only to say that they're constantly doing construction. They're constantly doing demolition. They're constantly clearing new areas of the city. They're constantly having insurance people come in and make decisions.
Right.
And so everything is in flux so much that it's hard to plan any new thing that's going to be very permanent.
Yeah.
Because everything around it's going to change.
Right.
So in a way, it's a disincentive to the kind of infrastructure building that you could do in a different city where you're like, okay, well, all these businesses have left. We need to do something, and at least we know the lay of the ground and how to plan for it.
Yeah. So it's so up in the air that these kind of pop-up uses and the sort of celebration of actually watching the act of destruction and how spaces are constantly changing kind of becomes part of the way people are living for the time being.
Right. And, again, I wasn't able to delve too deeply into
Sure.
this.
Well, you were on your honeymoon.
But right. But there's also this interesting sense in which pop-ups create their own, at least potential political controversy, where you're a stakeholder in a certain spot in the city, and nothing's going to be done for it for a year, and so of course you want people in your city to enjoy things, and there's an opportunity for a pop-up. But then what if that pop-up becomes really popular, right? What if it's a coffee shop in a shipping container and people really start to love it, and a year later it's really successful, and that's where your competing business, or even just the physical space where you want to be, is. And the fact that the regulatory rules are kind of up in the air, and maybe central authority from the central government or from the Christchurch government, someone can come in and say, those were the ground rules before, but it just makes sense to do this different thing. So, lots of really thorny questions and no really obviously just or unjust answers.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of the experiments here in the U.S. with pop-ups have sort of run into the same issues, although, obviously not in the sort of post-earthquake setting, but there's been a lot of innovation in San Francisco and with these kind of pop-up uses that people end up really liking, and the whole concept of the pop-up was invented to get around a lot of the sort of harder to navigate zoning uses in certain neighborhoods, but then actually transforming those pop-ups into sort of a permanent entity can be even more difficult. That was the whole point of the pop-up in the first place. Right. So I can imagine that the people of Christchurch might do well to talk to some of the other cities and folks who are really innovating in the sort of temporary use world, and on how and whether they've ever been able to sort of make something stick.
Yeah. Well, one thing that actually surprised me was talking to a couple of people who were involved in the post-earthquake attempts at recovery, talking about the shortage of Christchurch in building experts to make calls about whether something should be rebuilt or not, or how safe it is, all these kinds of things. And I guess I sort of imagine in my mind that these people exist in Tokyo and San Francisco, and that they just would fly anywhere there's a big earthquake, and that's what happens. That it's the nature of their profession to do that. And I guess I just forget that New Zealand is very, very far away from everything. And
right, they've got a unique set of challenges.
Yeah, and that's been part of this. That put the same city somewhere in Oregon, and you'd have San Franciscans up there with expertise in this kind of building.
Yeah.
But there's just not that same expertise, and building it on the fly is a really difficult thing, even in a very connected world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So another thing that being in Christchurch made me think of was an American city, Portland, Oregon, where I've spent a bunch of time recently, and which a lot of people don't realize is very vulnerable to a big earthquake.
Right. Well, there's that huge fault line running under the whole Pacific Northwest, right? That it's been dormant for a long time, but it's, as far as I understand, it's not really a question of if, it's sort of when, whether it's next year or decades from now, both, not just Portland, but Seattle and Vancouver are all pretty vulnerable to a really large earthquake, kind of like what happened in Chile a couple years ago.
Yeah, and my understanding is that they've pieced together the eruptions of this fault by looking at past tsunamis on that part of the coast.
Okay.
And their understanding is that it happens once every 300 years or so, and that we're about 360 years since it's happened.
Got it.
So it really is.
Yeah.
It really is any time.
But we're talking about like a mega earthquake. It's not just sort of your standard Los Angeles earthquake, or even like a bigger Los Angeles earthquake. It's like a really massive quake.
Yeah, we're talking about a major earthquake, and And fortunately, Portland isn't right on the coast. There are actually
Right.
a lot of little communities right on the Oregon coast that are in a lot of trouble because
from flooding.
They're from tsunamis.
Yeah.
That they're basically the earthquakes are probably big enough that they'll destroy all the bridges that are the escape routes for these people on the coast, and so the Oregon coast is a really dicey scene for that reason, and they have they've kind of been awakened to this, especially since the tsunami in Japan, that caused them to do some evacuation drills and stuff like that. But really, there could be a scenario where even that doesn't matter, and a bunch of people get caught in that tsunami. Oregon, of course, is not right on the coast; it's a little bit inland, and hopefully will be farther removed from the earthquake for that reason. But then there are a lot of reasons why Oregon or why Portland is in a bad spot. One, because it wasn't built in the way that San Francisco is, with the expectation that there were going to be a lot of earthquakes.
Right.
And it didn't benefit. It's a strange way to put it, but
it didn't have a major earthquake in the early part of the
Right.
of the 20th century to sort of
Right.
respond
Buildings
to.
were knocked down, and in San Francisco, lots of weak buildings fell in old earthquakes.
Yeah.
That benefits people today. That hasn't happened in Portland. Portland, uses a lot of brick in its buildings, and that's a bad thing in earthquakes. It also, one thing it has going for it is that it's a relatively residential city, even though it's pretty urban. Lots of people live in houses that are 1 or 2 stories.
Right.
But the Pearl in Portland, the kind of downtown, has a bunch of taller buildings that are made out of glass, and that's going to be a really bad area, especially because there's a river running through Portland, the Willamette River, and there are a bunch of bridges crossing it. And so one of the most catastrophic things in this earthquake that people project is likely to happen is that the ground on either side of the river is the kind of ground that liquefies in an earthquake. So for people who are unfamiliar, if you imagine taking kind of a big tray of sand and water and kind of shaking it in the way that the water saturates the sand,
right,
and then kind of liquefies it. And the different sides of the riverbank are expected to move enough and to liquefy enough that all of the bridges that connect the two sides of Portland could go down. And a bunch of buildings on both sides of the river. And one side of the river is a kind of urban downtown. That land could liquefy and cause just tremendous damage to all those structures. And then the last thing is schools. A lot of the schools in Portland are unreinforced masonry, and that's obviously another nightmare scenario.
Yeah,
an earthquake happen while school is in session. And so, you can look online at Portland earthquake maps and look at what parts of the city are most vulnerable to liquefaction. But Portland really hasn't done a very good job of getting ahead of this and investing in the sort of infrastructure that could at least mitigate the damage. And Christchurch is, unfortunately, an example they should look at for the aftermath of an earthquake, even as they ought to spend more money than they are kind of preparing for one.
Is your sense that the people, that the government in Portland and the state of Oregon is just not, that they don't have the funds to prepare, or that they're sort of in denial about this being a real inevitability?
There's an earthquake authority. Like I said, they've been doing things along the coast, and they're aware it's going to happen. I just think that it's almost impossible to get people, to get residents, to get citizens to spend a lot of money on something that they can't really conceive of.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if I spend a bunch of time reporting on the earthquake authority. I don't know if they've been admirably proactive or if they have been falling down on the job. I don't know that it matters. I just think that, maybe if there was, Oregon is a state where you can put things on the ballot. Maybe if there's a federal infusion of funds, maybe if there's a state ballot law that drew attention to this and said we're going to, add to our sales tax, or we're going to borrow money to do these kinds of infrastructure improvements, maybe that would make a difference.
Yeah.
It's certainly worth trying, in my opinion, but...
Right. Well, unfortunately, I think what we've learned in the last few months too is that sometimes it takes one really bad disaster in certain regions before people kind of wake up and start talking realistically about planning for the future. You know, take a look at the aftermath of Sandy in New York and New Jersey, just for example. You know, there you had kind of, you know, the conservative leaders of those two states really coming out and talking very seriously about rising sea levels and climate change in a way that, you know, they might not have a year ago. Because they're just confronted with the you know, undeniable reality that they are in the path of destruction of rising sea levels, and so now maybe, you know, hopefully there will be sort of real preparations, and you know the city of New York at least has already appointed you know, a sort of flooding czar to start, you know, talking realistically about what, you know, what they can actually do to be more resilient in the face of floodwaters, because I doubt anybody in Manhattan ever thought that this kind of flooding would really happen so soon, until it happened.
Right. Yeah. So so can you tell me a little bit more about, you know, I've seen proposals for kind of seawalls, I guess.
Right.
And others for just kind of boning up the infrastructure in a more basic way so that subways don't flood, and so that streets maybe drain a little bit better. What's your sense of, you know, I guess, what's the shape of the debate, and how is it going to be ultimately determined? Right.
So, you know, there's sort of two schools in the planning world on, you know, what realistically ought to be you know, the main priority going forward, you know, in New York City, but also, you know, coastal cities all over the world there's a long list of cities that are vulnerable to severe flooding, you know, both in the developed world and in the developing world. But, you know, in New York, I mean, there are serious discussions about building a big wall. It would be hugely expensive, and, you know, obviously it only solves, you know, the problem of flood, you know, really high floodwaters up to a point, however big you build the wall. And, you know, the argument against spending, you know, billions and billions of dollars constructing something of that nature, like literally like a sort of, you know, a big flood wall, is that, you know, how can you predict for sure how high that wall is going to need to be? And inevitably, you know, there will come a day where it's not tall enough, and, you know, whether or not that's really the smartest way to go. You know, there are sort of smaller on the ground measures that the city, you know, was probably considering at this point that have been proposed for, you know, even before Sandy, you know, to help prevent the subway system from flooding, for example. There are ways that you can kind of build elevated entrances to underground subway systems, you know, where the vents and the entrances are actually up higher, so that even if floodwaters kind of came up on, you know, into the city and into the streets, that at least the water would have a ways more to go over a sort of platform. We actually have a piece up on the Atlantic Cities about some of the ideas that have been proposed over the last couple of years. They were all collected in a MoMA exhibit not too long ago, sort of presciently, on how to, you know, sort of protect Lower Manhattan from flooding. So you can actually check that out on the Atlantic Cities. But you know, a lot of it is like, you know, kind of retrofitting some of the subway entrances in the way that, so that you sort of imagine like walking up a set of stairs before you walk down the stairs. Or, you know, building kind of, you know, you probably saw a lot of photos before and after the storm of, you know, a lot of sandbags kind of stacked up around the vents that lead to the subway, you know, many of which flooded. You know, there are actually ways you can build structures around, you know, up and around those vents, so that you wouldn't actually need to deploy sandbags every time. Now, that's also very expensive. A lot of this debate kind of boils down to a bigger picture debate going on in planning circles right now, because there's a guy named Andrew Zolli who has a book out now about resiliency. And he's been, writing op-eds for the New York Times, and there was a really good story about this in Slate back in October, actually. It's this idea that for a long time now, planners have been really, especially environmentally focused planners, been really focused on this concept of sustainability. That, it's our sort of moral obligation to come up with green building standards and ways to plan our cities for the future where they're going to have less of an impact on the environment. And in fact, much of Lower Manhattan, when it was rebuilt after 9/11, adhered to very strict green building standards. So many of the new buildings down there, even in the flooding area, are in fact incredibly green. And that's been, certainly a hallmark of the Bloomberg administration. However, there's a sort of tension between this idea that we ought to be mostly focused on sustainability with the idea that we ought to be focused on making sure we can recover from disasters. There may only be so much we can do to mitigate rising sea levels at this point. From a sort of source perspective. And so, a lot of the folks in the sort of, who work in the field of building cities and planning are now calling for a shift in focus towards resiliency, which is a different kind of way of thinking, where you have to be able to have a lot of options in order to adapt to crises that are inevitably coming. And the tension there ends up kind of being, so if we build a giant seawall, are we just admitting the fact that the seas are going to rise and we're not going to do anything to try to slow it down? Or is it just more practical to build a seawall? Is it more practical to invest in kind of temporary structures that we could inflate? A lot of the sort of tactics of the Army, for example, where when they go in to sort of deal with disasters, they've got all kinds of inflatable infrastructure. They can put a temporary bridge over a flooded river in order to get people out. And are those the kinds of technologies that cities should be investing in at this point, as opposed to, being mostly focused on sustainability? So there's a lot of talk right now about whether those two concepts are really at odds with each other, or whether they can coexist.
Mm-hmm. One thing I'm really curious about is, in the world today, we have these very different models of how these decisions are made. Right, where you look to someplace like China, where the central government, if it wanted to, could dictate urban planning down to a pretty low level,
and they do.
And compared to someplace like the United States, where you have different jurisdictions at the federal, state, and local level, all of whom are making different decisions, and to the extent that the federal government is influencing things, it's usually through funding. And it's kind of an interesting question to ponder, quite apart from the morality or political theory underlying these different systems. Which of these systems is going to be better at resiliency?
Right.
Is it the case that the people with the biggest incentive to be resilient are the people who actually live in a place and who are in danger if a natural disaster they're unprepared for comes? Is it the case that for some reason that incentive doesn't work and central planning is actually better for certain kinds of things?
Mm-hmm.
And then we have, natural experiments that are regional experiments, right? Where you have in the New York area planning for disasters that are going to affect the region, but you've got Michael Bloomberg leading part of the charge, and you've got Chris Christie leading another part of the charge, and maybe these little pieces very close to one another are going to do different things, and we're going to see how that's going to play out.
Right. I mean, I guess it goes back to sort of Mitt Romney's FEMA comments. We're somehow still talking about Mitt Romney even after a couple months after the election, but you know.
Well, and I actually, you know, I think we should have a strong. I think we should have a strong FEMA. I also think one of the things that I covered as a young reporter was this wildfire in this area of eastern Los Angeles County and western San Bernardino County.
Okay.
And it was all these relatively, there were suburbs, but you know, relatively dense building. This was kind of the moment when the housing boom had really taken off in that area.
Yeah.
And so people were building up into the hills, and in this area, a big fire comes along maybe once in a generation.
Okay.
And this was that fire, and it kind of swept across. It kind of smoldered behind the mountains, and then the shift came in the winds, and the Santa Ana winds came and blew it over the top of the mountains and just down on the city, and or I guess down on a series of cities, I should say. And one of the things that I really remember is one of these areas is a historically horse riding area. It was a bunch of horse trails up in the hills that kind of slowly got overtaken by development, but there were still some horse trails, and a lot of the houses at the very outer end of development, like right up against the wilderness, were these houses with that were zoned for like horse barns and back.
Okay.
And so you had this relatively urban area, and right at the edge you had just a surprisingly high population of horses. And this was in Rancho Cucamonga, California.
Sure, yeah, I know the area
That I covered.
Yeah.
And Alta Loma is the area with all the horses, and the Alta Loma Riding Club was this organization. I mean, it couldn't have been that old because Alta Loma isn't that old compared to other parts of the United States, but, you know, several decades old at least. And these people had been practicing for years and years. They had like two practice sessions a year of how are we going to evacuate all of the horses if a serious fire comes.
Okay.
And it was partly because these people had lived in the area long enough that they remembered the last fire, and it was partly that they owned these horses and were horse lovers and couldn't stand the idea of them burning up in a fire.
Sure, of course.
And it was partly that they knew the area and knew how they had to back the trailers up into certain access roads that were going to be the ones that didn't get clogged. And so both the impetus to do this and carrying it out successfully, it was just indispensable that these people lived actually in the community and were invested in it.
Okay.
And it's an example of how, despite wanting a good FEMA, I think it's really important to fund this kind of stuff at the local level, and maybe preferable to have it be as resilient as possible at the local level, and count on FEMA as a very secondary thing. And I think that is maybe the model that some people actually do mean when they say we want FEMA to be good, but not that everyone means.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I agree necessarily. Perhaps there could be some, one-off examples of sort of, really community-based planning for disasters that are based, like you said, on sort of this, love of horses or something very particular that forces people to kind of think more practically about planning for the future. But, I've spent a number of years covering local governments, and specifically here in D.C. And, my experience has been that sort of the more local the government, the worse they are at planning for the future. Whether that's sort of saving money for a rainy day or sort of just thinking more long term seems to be quite difficult at the sort of municipal level of government. So if I would really worry that if we were counting on city governments and state governments to, spend as much as they can as what they need to spend in order to prepare, much like we were talking about in Oregon and in Portland, that that's probably not going to happen, and it may really I think it does really require a larger presence from the federal government, at least in this country, to put these plans in place. Like, for example, the federal government, and obviously DC is a special case because so much of the land here is actually owned by the federal government. But, the federal government has been involved in actually shoring up the flood plan for the National Mall for a couple of years now. They announced it back in, I think, 2010. And, it's just practically impossible that the DC city government would have ever tried to undertake anything like that.
I certainly agree that there are certain things that the federal government has to do if they're going to get done. I guess the local. I don't know if it's local control or local investment or whatever it is that I want to see.
Maybe it's local ideas,
Well, I don't know that existing forms of local government are the ideal thing.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing that I described, the Alto Loma Riding Club, was
right, not a government,
private partnership organization, right, not a government, and so maybe it's federal investment in these local entities. Maybe it's creating like regional disaster planning boards. I don't know exactly what it should look like. I just do think that there's value in creating infrastructure at the very local level, and that I also, as a Californian who looks at how California is covered in the national media. And can only imagine how it must look to a Portlander or someone from Seattle who gets covered even less. I don't think that Hurricane Sandy would have had the same impact if it didn't happen in the media center of the.
Is that right?
In the media center of the country. I
think
the disasters that hit Washington and New York City, I think that they hit the ruling elite of America, and that the response is therefore proportionally larger. And I mean,
do you think that Hurricane Sandy was covered more than Katrina?
I certainly think that. I mean, it's hard to say in a post-Katrina world, right? Because the fact that Hurricane Katrina was such a disaster maybe itself made us more attuned to the danger of hurricanes.
I would say that's probably true.
Yeah. So I think it's hard to say, but I think that certainly before Hurricane Katrina, it just was much harder, right? Even if the media had a genuine desire to cover everything equally and didn't think that New York and DC were more important than other cities, which is an assumption that I would rely on. Hurricane Katrina, you didn't know what was going to happen until the hurricane blew in. Do you send people all the way from New York to cover it? You have to fly them down. You have to figure out where you're going to put them. They don't have local knowledge. They don't have families that they. Well,
and it really, in that case, it wasn't even really the storm. It was when the levees broke that actually caused all the damage, and there was no way to sort of plan.
So to sum up my thought, it's just that the media, for better or worse, is focused in D.C. and New York, and I trust it a little bit less to cover natural disasters elsewhere, to hold governments accountable as much elsewhere, and I think that in a sense that does matter. There are these regional prejudices, and I don't think California has the worst of it by any stretch of the imagination. I think probably a disaster in Appalachia, where there's
of course
not very much investment by the rest of the country in this place, and it's not very politically powerful, and so I think there's self-interested reasons. Even though I want a strong FEMA and think that it ought to be funded and it's an important thing to fund, there are self-interested reasons why other parts of the country should think, well, hopefully it will perform well, but we're not going to rely on it.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly with the number of reporters living in New York City, we were treated to a lot more sort of, on-the-ground reporting than we might have otherwise been of the immediate aftermath of Sandy.
Right, yeah.
I'd say I'd be willing to claim guilty to that, but, I guess I'm not sure that I would argue that this country has learned a lot about, how how important the sort of crucial moments after a disaster really are in the post-Katrina world. And if there was a major earthquake in Portland and really terrible damage and lives lost, I can't imagine that this country's media would ignore it or anything.
I don't think that. I think that they would make efforts to cover it for sure, and hopefully, hopefully it'll be long enough that they are prepared when it happens. Are there any other? We mentioned New Orleans just for a second. I know that there have been a bunch of. I've read a lot about the efforts to, have school reform since they've had the hurricane, and to have rebuilding different neighborhoods and tourist areas. But what about the resilience of the city? Is it any better than it was when Katrina happened?
Yeah, I'm not sure anyone can actually answer that yet. Obviously they've been working on reinforcing and rebuilding the levees, but New Orleans is obviously still in danger, and there were a lot of debates about whether where and which neighborhoods should be rebuilt, and that city has such a unique cultural history that there are a lot of sort of cultural reasons to rebuild certain neighborhoods that maybe were more vulnerable than others.
Yeah.
But could there be another levees breaking type situation in New Orleans? Hopefully the Corps of Engineers have done their jobs this time, but I don't know that anybody could say.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if we'll ever look back now at our present level of resiliency and look at ourselves as we look at past generations and think, wow.
We were really unprepared.
Yeah, I mean, we look back and think, wow, that many people died in an earthquake. Or we don't even have to look back. We look at foreign cities that have inferior infrastructure, where an earthquake just causes tens of thousands of deaths. It'll be interesting to see. It feels like we're coming into this period where things are going to get worse.
That's absolutely true. Think about the bridge collapse in Minneapolis a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
What we've got in the U.S. and major U.S. cities is, decades of underinvestment in infrastructure and safety. The number of bridges in this country that need to be replaced, with or without an earthquake or a disaster that are just structurally, dubious because we haven't spent the money to fix them up is pretty shockingly high. So, I guess I would venture to say that we may not have to wonder how we will feel about how we've prepared for very long. What happened in New York is going to happen elsewhere, and there are going to be other just infrastructure-based disasters coming down the road. I think it's just a matter of time.
Do you know about any successful example? We've been talking about how hard it is to get people to rationally think about how much they ought to be spending on infrastructure because it's hard to conceive of a disaster happening and this kind of thing. Do you know of any successful examples of kind of forward-looking, this campaign achieved it, or this farsighted executive or legislature?
Right.
Or, is there any place to look to for a model of how this might work elsewhere?
Well, I'm not sure that I can think of like a specific piece of infrastructure that was reinforced and then a disaster came and thank God we did that. Partly probably because that's not the way we tend to think about how we report on these things. A story about, they did the right thing and nothing bad happened doesn't end up being a great headline. So I'd actually love to read more about those.
Yeah. And before we close, what else? Is there anything else on the city site right now that people should check out if they're unfamiliar with it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, in the same theme of disaster history, we have a little item up today about a new initiative from Google that where they're actually it was inspired by the tsunami disaster in Japan, but Google has gone in and is helping the citizens in the worst affected areas in Japan to document the structures that have now been deemed are not savable, and so they're all being torn down. But what they've done is sort of put together a means of creating a digital archive of memories of places that will soon no longer exist. So there's an item up about that. So please check it out, and we've got a bunch of other stories up today that may be of interest.
Yeah, today and every day.
Yes, theatlanticcities.com.
All right. Well, I am at theatlantic.com, and thanks, Summer. It's been fun.